Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So this will be Doorways in Time, the Great Archaeological Discoveries, number 9, Troy. And this is part 2. So in my first lecture on Troy, I discussed the life and career of Heinrich Schliemann, the main discoverer of the ruins, and I talked about how he ended up resolving to try to uncover the remains of ancient Troy at the hill called Hissarlik, and the various campaigns of excavation that he carried out, and some of what he found, including the famous so-called Priam's treasure. And as we saw more than once, Schliemann wrapped up his undertakings at Troy and moved on, or tried to move on, to other projects. But in the late 1880s, he was drawn back to the site because of a raging debate over whether his finds at Troy were genuine and whether they really represented the ancient city described in the Iliad. He then died while traveling back in Europe in December 1890. So that's where we left off the story. But in fact, this was not really the end of the story, but in many ways it was just the beginning. So after Schliemann's death in the early 1890s, the excavator Wilhelm Dörfeld continued to carry on excavations at Hissarlik. And he was able to go further in reconstructing several layers of the site that could be dated to the Bronze Age. He began to make guesses based on comparisons to other sites, such as in Mesopotamia, as to the exact chronology of these layers. And at this point, he surmised that level 6 probably corresponded to the time of the Trojan War, basically the end of the Bronze Age. And he was able to map out important buildings, including temples and a palace complex in the citadel, the inner or upper city, from roughly that time. After 1894, the site was again covered over and then was left basically undisturbed from then through the time of World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. In the 1930s, under the new Republic of Turkey, the site was reopened. In 1932, an American team, led by the archaeologist Carl Blagan from the University of Cincinnati, again excavated and re-examined the site, basically picking up where Dörfeld had left off in 1894. And this team was also able to forensically analyze more fine-grained details of the remains, such as seeds that had been preserved in ceramics, and they were able to compare the materials to other newly excavated sites in the Near East. And experts also sorted through and categorized the different materials that Schliemann had left jumbled together. And the team concluded that, broadly speaking, the site had 9 layers, representing 9 different eras of the city as it had been built up through the centuries, going from the early Bronze Age, starting around 3000 BC, all the way up through the Roman era. Then, moreover, in the later 20th century, starting in 1988, another team led by the German archaeologist Manfred Korfmann began to excavate further outside the walls in those areas where the sort of middle layers, as we saw, were better preserved. And this project lasted through the 1990s and was able to use new tools and technologies like ground-penetrating radar and carbon dating. They found remains of thousands of dwellings and workshops extending far beyond the city walls, down the slopes of the hill and into the plains and valleys below, forming a sprawling lower city. And their reports, when they were published in 2001, were very controversial, with some refusing to believe that Troy could have ever been such an enormous city and a major trading hub, rather than the fringe outpost of civilization. But Korfmann's arguments seem to have been further bolstered by later finds and studies, and it's now fairly widely accepted that at certain points in the Bronze Age, Troy was a major city, probably controlling trade and traffic through the Dardanelles. So just in brief, these layers as they've been understood and reconstructed in recent times. As I said, there are 9 basic layers, but some have also now been further subdivided into smaller epochs. So, in brief, layer 1, which is the lowest, closest to the bedrock, represents the remains of a small, compact town from the early Bronze Age, first settled around 3000 BC. Its fortifications were crude stone walls, a gate, flanked by 2 square towers, and inside were small, tight-packed row houses. The residents, it seems, produced simple, hand-built pottery, tools of copper, stone, and bone. And this settlement lasted around 500 years until it was destroyed, apparently by fire, around 2500 BC. So that was followed then by Troy II, which was a much larger city. There were encircling walls enclosing an area at least 4 times as large as Troy I, as well as habitations extending beyond the walls. The walls themselves were large, thick, and earthquake-resistant, punctuated by multiple towers and gates, including a main gateway facing west onto the plain, surmounted by a large jutting tower. There was a large paved ramp leading up to the main gate of the citadel, and inside the citadel was a 2-story palace centering on a large throne room and meeting hall called the Megaron. Artisans produced wheel-thrown pottery and sophisticated jewels, vessels, and weapons in copper, bronze, silver, and especially gold. Troy too seems to represent a literal and figurative golden period, which lasted only about 200 years, before it was destroyed, probably by invaders, around 2300 BC. Now above level 2, there are levels 3 through 5, which are the most difficult to reconstruct. They've been the most severely disturbed by the regrading of the hill in ancient times, and then again by Schliemann's aggressive excavations in the 1870s. These layers, 3, 4, and 5, seem altogether to represent about 550 years, from about 2300 BC to the mid-1700s BC. And in this time, it seems Troy was a somewhat diminished town, resettled by survivors or migrants after the disaster of 2300 BC. And the town was basically built into the ruins and foundations of Troy II. And in this period, there also were at least some epochs of prosperity and extensive trade. For example, some Minoan artifacts from the civilization on Crete have been found in Troy 5. Then comes layer 6, which seems to represent a kind of second flourishing, or you could say a silver age, starting after 1700 BC. So at this point, the city again extended far out into the plains beyond the hilltop. Korfmann's excavations in the 1990s suggested that Troy 6 was about 16 times larger altogether than had previously been thought. It seems to have been a prominent trading center with pottery from all around the Aegean, including Mycenae and Crete, as well as from Cyprus and the Levant. On the hilltop was a citadel with multiple terraces supporting many large, multi-story, almost palatial houses, perhaps housing elite clans, and also palaces and towers with cisterns, suggesting that it could shelter people during a siege. The city at this time seems to have been more militarized than in previous periods. It had massive 30-foot-high walls with several narrow gateways with twisting passages to impede invaders. And it had several large towers, including a very tall observation tower, which presumably could look out over the plains and the seacoast all the way to the Dardanelles. And hence the city may have been designed to serve as a stronghold to monitor and control shipping to the Black Sea. This period lasted about 450 years, and it seems that at the end of this time the city was destroyed, apparently by an earthquake, since many walls crumbled or collapsed, but there's no sign of fire. Then, immediately after this, we see layer 7, which represents the city at the end period of the Bronze Age. And it seems it was largely rebuilt and repaired after the earthquake, but with significant changes. It seems as if long-distance trade diminished, and there are signs of perhaps greater instability in the region. The houses are smaller and crowded closer together, much like back at the beginning in Troy I, especially within the citadel. And perhaps this represents a greater need for security within the citadel walls. Many houses also had pithoi, or giant ceramic vases for holding grain and other foodstuffs, buried into their cellars, perhaps showing fear of a siege. So this is, broadly speaking, layer 7. Now, in recent years, this layer has been further subdivided into two subphases, 7a and 7b. It seems as if 7a was destroyed by attackers with signs of burning and possibly violence, including broken weapons and unburied bodies. And this destruction seems to date to around 1180 to 1190 BC, which happens to be remarkably close to the traditional date, as calculated by later chroniclers, the traditional date for the Greek sack of Troy, which was supposedly in 1184 BC. Now, these calculated dates are not at all reliable. This is all sort of retrospective reconstruction from many years later based on genealogies. It's extremely imprecise. But nonetheless, this apparent destruction of Troy 7a does seem to occur remarkably close to when later Greeks imagined the Trojan War to be. It also happens to fall right into the time period where we see a rapid wave of civilizational collapse that swept through the Bronze Age Near East in about the 1170s BC. So altogether, the evidence here, although it's incomplete, nothing is absolute proof, it does seem to confirm that there probably is some historical basis for the story of the Trojan War, and that Troy 7a is the doomed city described in the Homeric legends. And in that light, the militarization of Troy 7a was probably a manifestation of the rising instability of the late Bronze Age, possibly caused by volcanic activity, famines, disease, all of which weakened urban states and empires. And so the sack of the city can be seen as one of many episodes where migrating warlike peoples attacked, pillaged, or destroyed declining cities. And one can think, for example, of the Sea peoples that raided Egypt, or the Aryans invading North India. And in this light, the story of the Trojan War, as seen in the Iliad, can be considered similar to the Hebrew book of Exodus or the Rig Veda from India, in the sense that it seems to be a composition written in the early Iron Age based upon memories of the Bronze Age collapse of several hundred years earlier, as recalled and retold by the descendants of the migratory peoples who attacked or raided the Bronze Age cities. But be that as it may, as I said, this is still pretty speculative. There's no definite proof here. But be that as it may, after the attack and destruction of Troy in the 1100s, it seems it was again re-inhabited and repaired, although very much diminished, with smaller houses crowded into the citadel and with many old buildings simply reused without even being renovated. And this 7b was finally destroyed by fire around 950 BC. So then we have layer 8, and in this period it seems for about 250 years the city was almost completely abandoned, with just a few inhabitants in the ruins. Around 700 BC, it began to be rebuilt, and it seems Greek migrants moved in. The old walls of Troy 6 were reused. The citadel was largely cleared and rebuilt, now in a Greek style, as an acropolis, mainly with temples. And it seems it had many visitors from around the Aegean. It seems to have become a kind of pilgrimage site. And it's interesting, as I noticed, and apparently as others have noted, it's interesting that this is about the same time that the Iliad was first written down in the form that we have today, and it was attributed to a Greek poet called Homer. And so it's worth wondering whether maybe the composition or the recording of this epic of the Iliad was related to the Greek resettlement and rebuilding of Troy going on at the same time. Maybe these Greeks sort of looked back to the legendary Trojan War and saw the Achaeans and even the Trojans too now as their forebears. It seems that Greeks in the classical period, and now we have some surviving written documents, Greeks in the classical period, so in the 500s, 400s BC, called this rebuilt town New Ilion, or New Troy. and it was visited by, among others, Alexander the Great, as he crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BC in his campaign against the Persians, and Alexander reportedly paid homage at a tomb outside the town said to be that of Achilles. Now, this Greek New Ilion, it seems, burned down in 85 BC, and then we have finally layer 9, which is from Roman-era Troy. So it seems the city was rebuilt and newly embellished by Romans who called it Novum Ilium. It was apparently very important to them. Troy was seen traditionally as a forebear of Rome. It was widely believed that the ancestor of the Romans, Aeneas, had escaped from the sack of Troy and journeyed into Italy. That is how the Virgil's epic, the Aeneid, begins, with Aeneas and his father and sons escape from Troy. In the Roman era, it seems Novum Ilium was a ceremonial and trading center, but it went into severe decline in the later Roman age. It seems it lost its commercial importance, especially after the Emperor Constantine built a new massive capital at Byzantium, which was a few hundred miles away on the Bosporus. And so hence overland trade crossing from Europe to Asia was redirected and funneled into this new metropolis. And also, I would imagine probably the conversion to Christianity did not help either. So after that point, it most likely was no longer a pilgrimage site, since it had no importance in Christian mythology. It seems the city became a backwater with a small and shrinking population living among the ruins, until it was finally abandoned around 600 AD and left to natural forces of weather and vegetation for more than 1,000 years, until the Victorians began to excavate it. So that's more or less the chronology that archaeologists have been able to reconstruct as to the eras of this city. But it still leaves many lingering questions about what sort of city this was, and even very fundamentally, who were the Trojans? Where did they come from? What language did they speak? Did they identify with any larger group or polity? Were they Greeks or something else? This is very hard to answer, for one thing because no writing has ever been found from the early to mid-Bronze Age, right? So the whole earlier era from 3000 BC on up until after 2000 BC, it doesn't seem there was any writing in Troy. There's been no sign of it. And even from the late Bronze Age, only one single inscription has ever been found, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this means that most of the city's history was prehistoric and not recorded in their own writing. So there are tremendous open questions here. So for one thing, who were the Trojans? There are different possibilities. Were they Greeks, as the Iliad seems to imply, right? They seem to speak Greek with the Achaeans. Were they local indigenous Anatolians, maybe speaking some unknown or extinct language? Were they Hittites? So this is another intriguing possibility. So the Hittites were a major empire that ruled over most of Anatolia, Syria, and Lebanon, at least in the later Bronze Age, from about the 1600s through the 1200s BC. Their capital of Hattusha was in central Anatolia, and the site was excavated beginning in the 1890s and through the 1930s. And so this is one place where some clues have been found as to what sort of city Troy was and who the Trojans were. Now, it took scholars decades to slowly piece together and translate the hundreds of tablets and fragments that were found in the archives of Hattusha. And it seems they contain a lot of diplomatic correspondence, especially from the 1200s BC, basically the last century or so before the fall of the Hittite Empire in the late Bronze Age collapse. And it appears now that a lot of the diplomatic correspondence from this time was with a king to the west of a people called the Ahiawans. That's what the Hittites called them, from a land to the west called Ahiawa. Now, most scholars now agree that this is most likely the same people that Homer calls the Achaeans or Achaeans from Achaia in southern Greece. And the correspondence from Hattusha shows feuding and contention between the Hittites and the Achaeans over control of towns on the Aegean coast of Anatolia. So it seems these towns on the eastern shore of the Aegean Sea fall into a kind of borderland zone between Hittite control to the east and Achaean control to the west. But the Hittites viewed these towns as basically vassal states under their own suzerainty, and they tried to block out Achaean infiltration. For example, in the 1980s, scholars translated a letter called the Tawa-Galawa letter, which was written in about the mid-1200s BC from the Hittite co-emperor Hattusili to the king of the Achaeans. And in this letter, he asks the Achaeans to stop sheltering fugitive rebels who were fomenting resistance and mutinies against Hittite rule in the Aegean coastal towns. Now, since Troy was on the Aegean coast of Anatolia, it stands to reason that it might have been one of these vassal states on the western edge of Hittite control. And there are indeed clues that seem fairly consistent with this idea. For one thing, a lot of the material culture of Troy in the late Bronze Age, such as in Troy 6, shows a lot of similarities to the Hittites. For instance, the building styles were very Hittite reminiscent. But also there are Greek influences as well, such as in the pottery. So it stands to reason it might have been in a kind of borderland zone between the Hittites and the Greeks. Now also, no writing has been found in Bronze Age Troy in either Greek or Hittite. But in 1995, archaeologists under Korfmann did find a bronze disc with an inscription in Luwian. So Luwian was an Indo-European language that was written with its own hieroglyphic writing system, and that it seems was commonly spoken in western Anatolia, including on the Aegean coast. And the Hittites, it seems, did call most of these coastal towns Luwian, and that was what they called their language as well. So this single inscription on a bronze disc raises the possibility, was Troy a Luwian city? And this would make sense even with the Homeric sources, since the name Priam, which is what Homer calls the last king of Troy, is a Luwian name, meaning courageous. So then the question is there a specific town in the Hittite records, a specific Luwian town or city that can be identified with Troy? Well, this is not totally certain, but it seems several Hittite texts do refer to a large, relatively important town in western Anatolia, which they called Wilusa. And if we think back to our Greek sources, the Greeks called Troy Troia, or alternatively, they called it Ilion or Ilios. And linguists analyzing the words and the prosody in Homer's texts have also argued that, in fact, Ilios had a W sound at the beginning, which was later dropped because it was lost out of the Greek language. But in Homeric Greek, the city was called not Ilios, but Wilios. So this then raises the possibility that many have argued for that Wilusa in the Hittite records is the same place referred to as Wilios or Troy by the Greeks. And Wilusa is mentioned again in that Tawa-Galawa letter. It's mentioned as a place that the Hittites and the Achaeans had previously disputed and feuded over. Now, it's important to note here that this reference in the Tawa-Galawa letter is not a record of the Trojan War. For one thing, it does not explicitly refer to war. It might have just been a diplomatic feud. And also, this feud would have been several centuries earlier than the alleged date of the Trojan War. So this does not provide any sort of proof of the Trojan War, but it does suggest that Troy was in a kind of disputed border zone between two larger powers. And hence this can help to fill in some of the background and context as to why a war might have broken out over Troy. Now, more importantly, there is another crucial earlier document that also refers to Wilusa. It's a treaty from the early 1200s, perhaps around 1280 BC, made between a previous Hittite emperor called Muwatalli II and a king of Wilusa who is called Alaksandu. And this treaty is important for at least three reasons. For one, it establishes that Wilusa would have been in a subordinate relation to the Hittites, partly self-governing, but owing fealty to the Hittites and entitled to Hittite protection in case of attack. Typical vassal or protectorate relationship. Secondly, it's significant that it names, as king of Wilusa, Alexandru. This is clearly a Greek name, right? It's Alexandros or Alexander. And this suggests a very early link between Wilusa and Greece, perhaps even suggesting that Greek might have been spoken in the city from very early on, as well as Luwian. Also, this is echoed in Homer's Iliad. One of the names of the Trojan prince Paris is Alexandros, and in fact, Homer uses that name for him more frequently than he uses the name Paris. We just call him Paris because it helps us not confuse him with Alexander the Great, who came later. But this again provides us with another very early textual connection between Wilusa in the Hittite records and Troy as described by Homer. Thirdly, the treaty names several patron gods who are understood to protect the city of Wilusa, and they include prominently Apollonias. This is again clearly echoed in the Iliad, where Troy is championed by three gods, including among them, and perhaps most importantly, Apollo, who in the ancient Greek is called Apollon. So this Apollonias is almost certainly the same deity as Apollon. Furthermore, it seems this god Apollonias is also invoked in another Luwian text. So he was part of the Luwian pantheon, and he's specifically invoked in this text as a god of plague and healing, just like Apollo in the Iliad, who inflicts plague upon the Greeks and then heals them. So all in all, from these clues in the Hittite and Greek texts and the archaeological finds, a picture can be roughly pieced together, where it does seem that Wilusa is very likely the inspiration for Troy in the Iliad, and that as of the 1200s BC, just before the alleged Trojan War, it was a city in a coastal borderland in a subordinate vassal relationship with the Hittites, but with a blend of influences, including Luwian, Hittite, and Greek. And this again seems to basically accord with the picture in the Iliad, where we see a city with both Greek and foreign elements. But if we go back specifically to this most mysterious element, the Luwian, this could offer more explanation for the legend of the Trojan War and how it might have come about. So the Luwians, it seems, from current archaeology, linguistics, it seems they were a largely trading people with harbor towns along the Aegean coast, and even colonies abroad where Luwians had settled, such as in Cyprus. They then played a large role in the late Bronze Age collapse. So as I said, there was this wave of sort of domino-like collapses of civilizations in the early 1100s BC, about the 1170s and 80s. And as empires like the Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks, and Egypt weakened after 1200 BC, it seems that the Luwians turned naturally from trading to raiding, thus further fueling the cycle of instability and collapse. So they set out in all directions, really, raiding the Hittite Empire to the east, the Mycenaean Greeks to the west, and apparently Egypt to the south. And current scholars widely think that many of the sea peoples that attacked Egypt in the 1100s BC were Luwians. So this too might put the story of the Trojan War in a new light. So according to Greek mythology, supposedly the war began with the Trojan prince Paris carrying off Helen, the queen of Sparta. And this could be taken then as a metaphor for Trojan or Luwian raids into Greece, which presumably probably included raiding of people, right? That was common in the ancient world. You would take captives from the places you raided. And hence the Greek expedition to Troy might have been a punitive counterattack, culminating in a siege and ultimately the destruction of the city. And further explanatory context could be provided by that treaty that we saw, which put Troy into a subordinate vassal protectorate relationship with the Hittites. It's possible that after 1200 BC, as the Hittite Empire began to fall apart, cities like Troy lost that Hittite protection, and hence they were now vulnerable to attack and raiding themselves in the way that they hadn't been before. So all in all, the story of the Trojan War makes more and more sense as this evidence is pieced together. And this is just what we see from cross-comparison and analysis of these Hittite and Greek sources. But to go back to the archaeology of Troy itself, I talked a great deal in the last lecture about how Schliemann and his colleagues unearthed so many spectacular artifacts and how there was ongoing controversy and confusion about who owned them, where exactly they came from, when they had come from, what they represented. And all of this has also taken more than a century to sort through and make sense of. And this is the last body of crucial evidence that I want to talk about here. So what became of all that treasure that Schliemann supposedly excavated from Hissarlik? This is actually a very important question. It was considered lost for many years, and in recent times, after it has resurfaced, it's become very important, as the study of small finds and artifacts has become more central to archaeology in recent years. So archaeologists have long used pottery to date sites. That's your most useful clue in determining the age of a site. But searching for other objects, especially precious metals and jewels, was long seen as rather vulgar and disreputable in professional archaeology. It was seen as the pursuit of grave robbers and treasure hunters, not of serious scholars. And some of you may know, I think I've mentioned before, there's long been a sort of ongoing family feud between traditional archaeologists and metal detectors, who can be looked down upon as just kind of selfish, mercenary treasure hunters. But this is what Schliemann had desired most of all. He wanted to find spectacular treasure under the earth. And he did find it in significant quantities. But for a time, most of it disappeared and then later resurfaced, just in time to be reappraised and appreciated in a new light. So in the 1870s, Schliemann toured around with Priam's treasure among the great museums of Europe. In 1879, he decided that the treasure ought to be put in a permanent, safe resting place, preferably with a prestigious museum. And he reached out to Rudolf Virchow, that scholar I've mentioned before, who was both a physician and an antiquarian. And Virchow happened to be a city councilman in the city council of Berlin. And he was very respected and well-connected. He had contacts with Otto von Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm I. And Virchow worked out a deal, an arrangement, where Schliemann would donate the entire treasure to the imperial museums in Berlin. And Schliemann all along wasn't really after money. He felt that he had plenty of money. He was happy to make more, such as off of his books, but he wanted prestige more so. So Virchow worked out a deal whereby Schliemann would donate the entire Priam's treasure to the imperial museums in Berlin, and in return he would be showered with honors and titles, including an honorary citizenship of Berlin. So the entire trove was deposited in the imperial museums in 1881, but he did continue to excavate both at Troy and at other sites around Greece. And he took most of the new finds home to Athens, where he cataloged and described them, grouped into 17 hoards or treasures, each of which he claimed to have found together in the same place and time. Although it seems he was often imprecise and probably grouped together many objects from the same general area, which he saw as being related. So hence these groupings are really more like just series, not hoards or treasures in the traditional sense, meaning collections that were intentionally buried together at one time, such as in a funereal burial or during a war. After the death of Schliemann in 1890, all of the remaining artifacts from Troy that had been in his possession were also given over to the Berlin Museum, which already housed Priam's treasure. After 1900, a curator in Berlin named Hubert Schmidt first catalogued the treasures from Troy. And some, such as the gold sauceboat-like vessel and the gold diadems, were put on permanent display in the museum. Others, like the thousands of gold earrings, were stowed away in the vaults. Now, in 1945, in the last months of the Second World War, Berlin was heavily bombed before being invaded. Most of the Imperial Museum and the surrounding neighborhood burned down before being occupied by Soviet troops. Thousands of artifacts in the museum were destroyed or disappeared, including almost all of the Trojan treasures. For over 40 years, they were considered lost. But in the 1980s, especially during the period of glasnost and perestroika in the Soviet Union, some junior curators and museum workers in the Soviet Union began reporting long-standing rumors that there were many European artworks, such as Impressionist paintings and sketches by Michelangelo, etc., stowed away in vaults underneath military bases and state museums all around the USSR, and some were reportedly even brazenly displayed in senior executives' offices. Some of these junior employees also researched into the museum's archives and found inventories recording the materials that the military had handed over to the state in the aftermath of the war. In 1991, 2 Russian whistleblowers told the press that they had seen proof of these secret stashes of looted art. And it soon came out that they included among them the vanished treasures from Troy. In 1993, the Russian state formally acknowledged that the rumors were true, and the Minister of Culture even acknowledged that he had seen Priam's gold himself. So what eventually came to light as documents were published was that during World War II, the German government had removed treasure out of the Imperial Museum to a bunker, and then subsequently hid them in a tower in the Berlin Zoo. When the Soviet army captured this tower, they requisitioned the treasures inside, basically as recompense for the reign of theft and destruction that the Nazis had already wrought upon the Soviet Union. The curator guarding them handed them over to the Soviet forces rather than risking seeing them destroyed or broken up. They were packed up in 3 crates and flown back to Moscow, and then entrusted to the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts, where they remained hidden away for 45 years. As of the 1990s, the Pushkin Museum possessed 259 items coming from 13 of the 17 hoards from Troy. It seems that some artifacts had been lost along the way at some point, either when the treasure was moved from the museum to the bunker, or from the bunker to the zoo, or when it was requisitioned from the zoo, flown to Moscow. At some point, some items were lost. But nonetheless, the museum did have 259 items, including the most famous and spectacular artworks, such as the gold vessels and diadems. Once this was revealed, legal disputes immediately erupted between Russia, Germany, and Turkey over who should own the treasures. But in the meantime, the curators at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow planned an exhibition of the artifacts, which opened in 1996, and the treasure was seen publicly for the first time in almost 60 years. And at the same time, the museum published a large illustrated volume with images and detailed information on each object, including the dimensions, materials, style, and most likely use and provenance, according to current scholarly opinion. And these artifacts reveal certain things about Troy, especially in the Troy II period, in the Middle Bronze Age, when most of these objects were made. So what are the contents surviving from Priam's treasure? Well, the largest number of them are jewels. And apart from the spectacular diadems and beaded necklaces, they are mostly small, such as earrings, finger rings, bracelets, and pins with elaborate decorative heads, most of them embellished with fine wire filigree. There also are vessels, including bottles, cups, and jars made of gold, silver, bronze, and electrum. A few human-shaped figurines made of bronze and lead. The 4 ceremonial hammer axes, which I mentioned were Schliemann's last find. Some bronze, copper, and silver blade weapons. Small decorative details such as pommels for swords or dagger handles made of rock crystal. And most abundant of all, something seemingly quite mundane, yet also very mysterious and potentially revealing. And that is 41 small lens-shaped discs made of rock crystal. They are all plano-convex, meaning flat on the bottom and curved or domed on top. They are all about 1 inch or a little less than an inch in width. They are of unclear purpose, Perhaps they were decorative studs for furniture or belts, such as one sees on medieval or Byzantine art. But none of them seem to have been found attached to anything, and also I would note none others have been found in any other material that you might expect to see, like jade or lapis. It's been proposed also that they might be game pieces or counting pieces. It's known that the Egyptians and the Sumerians were lovers of board games, but no game boards have been found at Troy. So this mystery of the lenses, you could say, may actually be a key to understanding the whole collection and what it reveals about Troy. So as we saw from Troy 2, there is a great abundance of gold artifacts, and the most abundant type of object by far is jewelry. Some artifacts, like earrings and gold vessels, show signs of wear and of breakage and repair. As is common, gold is a very soft material, and if it's worn or used frequently, it tends to break or bend and needs to be repaired. But also, crucially, there are other gold objects, especially jewels, that do not show signs of wear or breakage. And in some groupings, there are several jewels with simple designs and no wear at all. And it's been theorized these seem to be preforms, in other words, model prototypes that craftsmen could use as templates for mass-producing jewels. So this suggests that a lot of these artifacts in the treasure might be from jewel-making workshops, which would make sense, for example, with Schliemann's discovery of the jar packed with thousands of earrings. Where would you find such a huge hoard of earrings except in a place that is mass producing and selling these items? The sites of the find seem to cluster together, especially around the citadel walls just outside the gateways, suggesting that perhaps these were jewelry-making districts with many artisans working in their own styles. And all of this seems to add up in suggesting that Troy had an extensive, productive jewel-making industry. And what is more, to support such an industry, Troy too would have had to be a kind of mecca for jewel making, serving a broader market through trade. So how could this have come about? Well, it seems the Troad area has many mineral resources, including in copper, silver, lead, and tin, so that could provide an initial impetus for a metalworking industry. And further, Roman chroniclers have said that the Troad once had large sources of gold, but by Roman times these gold mines had been exhausted and picked clean. This then could account for why so much gold treasure was found in Troy 2, but none in Troy 6 and 7, that later period of flourishing. And even more, it might be an explanation for why Troy 2 in the 2000s BC was so prosperous, because it was a center for mining and working gold into fine objects. So then finally, if we think back to those rock crystal discs, maybe they were exactly what they look like, i.e. they were little magnifying lenses used by the jewelry makers, especially as they added the fine filigree details onto their creations. So these small objects, which seem to be mundane, even valueless, actually may turn out to be the most revealing of all of what sort of city Troy was and what the people there actually did all those thousands of years ago. So I'd like to end the lecture here, and I like having this be the ending point because I think it's a great encapsulation of how archaeology, by reconstructing context, can turn something strange, mysterious, alien, or just insignificant into something revealing and strikingly familiar and immediate. You can almost imagine these craftsmen, hunched over their work tables with these little finely polished crystal lenses, adding on the little filigree threads onto their jewels and vessels. So thank you so much for listening, and if you want to hear all the patron-only lectures, including my last lecture in Doorways in Time on the Dead Sea Scrolls, please go to my Patreon page, the link is in the description, and sign up at any level. Thank you.